Gunfire shattered the Wyoming night like glass against stone. Miriam Vance pressed her back against the kitchen wall, Thomas's old rifle trembling in her hands as bullets splintered the window frame above her head. Orange flames devoured the barn 40 yards away, casting hellish shadows that danced across her children's terrified faces. "Ma, they're coming through the back." Clara's voice cut sharp through the chaos, her 16-year-old frame crouched low beside the overturned table where 8-year-old Rose whimpered. Another volley erupted from the darkness beyond the corral. The twins Ezra and Levi huddled against the stone hearth, their 12-year-old hands clutching kitchen knives that seemed pitiful against the thunder of Winchester rifles. Smoke poured through the broken windows, choking the air with the stench of burning hay. And something darker than the acrid smell of kerosene deliberately spread. Miriam's telegraph operator instinct screamed through the terror. This wasn't random violence. The attackers moved with military precision, cutting off escape routes, herding them toward the front door where more guns waited. Someone wanted them alive, or wanted their deaths to look like an accident. A war cry pierced the gunfire, wild and primal, rising from somewhere near the burning barn. The shooting faltered for a heartbeat. In that suspended moment, a shadow moved against the flames, a lone figure wielding something that glinted silver in the firelight. "Who is that?" Clara whispered. Miriam's throat tightened. She knew that cry, had heard it echoing across the Bitter Creek Valley when the Cheyennes still hunted these plains. But the tribes had been driven north years ago. What warrior would risk everything to enter this battle? The stranger's silhouette cut through the smoke like a blade through silk, and for one impossible moment Miriam dared to hope. Then fresh gunfire erupted, and the shadow vanished into the inferno, consuming everything they had left. 6 months earlier, the Wyoming Territory had baked under a merciless sun that turned the grasslands to tinder and the creek beds to cracked clay. Miriam Vance stood in the doorway of her kitchen, watching the horizon shimmer with heat waves that made the distant mountains dance like mirages. At 35, she bore the weathered beauty of a woman who had learned to find strength in scarcity. Her dark hair pulled back severe and practical. Her calloused hands steady despite the tremor of exhaustion that never quite left her bones. The telegraph key sat silent on the kitchen table, its brass mechanism polished to a dull gleam from years of use. Once those dots and dashes had connected her to a world beyond, the endless sky and rolling prairie. As the territory's only certified telegraph operator outside of Cheyenne City, she had transmitted everything from cattle prices to marriage proposals, earning enough to keep food on the table and hope in her children's eyes. But that was before the cholera took Thomas and their eldest boy Samuel. Before the debts mounted like storm clouds on the horizon. "Ma, the Henderson place is burning." Clara appeared beside her, pointing toward a column of black smoke rising from the valley below. At 16, she possessed an unsettling intelligence that made her seem older than her years, with Thomas's sharp cheekbones and a stubborn set to her jaw that Miriam recognized all too well. "Our 3rd fire this month," Miriam murmured, watching the smoke dissipate into the cloudless sky. Henderson couldn't make his payments either. The Wyoming debt ledger system was a peculiar cruelty of territorial law. When a family defaulted on their obligations, the courthouse in Bitter Creek would post their names in the public square, marking them for auction, like livestock. Everything land buildings, livestock, personal property, even family labor contracts would be sold to the highest bidder to satisfy the debt. It was a system that fed on desperation and fattened the coffers of men like Gideon Warwick. "How much do we owe?" Clara asked quietly. Miriam closed her eyes. $307. The number hung between them like a death sentence. Thomas's failed ventures, the mine shaft that yielded nothing but fool's gold, the cattle that died in the harsh winter of '82, the seed grain that rotted in the unseasonable spring rains, had left debts that compounded with interest like a cancer eating away at their future. Maybe Nathaniel Kane would help. Clara suggested, though her voice lacked conviction. Miriam almost smiled at that. Nathaniel Kane, their nearest neighbor, was fighting his own battle against foreclosure. The man who had once commanded 2,000 head of cattle and employed a dozen ranch hands now struggled to keep food on his own table. His wife Sarah's death in what the territorial authorities called an Indian raid had broken something fundamental in him, leaving him to work his vast acreage alone while creditors circled like vultures. "Mr. Kane has troubles enough," Miriam said. "We'll find another way." But even as she spoke the words, she felt the weight of their impossibility. The telegraph work had dried up as the railroad pushed through, bringing its own communication lines. Her small vegetable garden and handful of chickens provided sustenance, but little income. Without a miracle, they would join the growing list of families whose names appeared on the Wyoming debt ledger, their lives sold to satisfy the territorial system's hunger for order and profit. The twins burst through the kitchen door, their faces flushed from running. Ezra and Levi were mirror images of each other at 12, sharing the same unruly brown hair and mischievous eyes that had gotten them into trouble since they could walk. "Ma, there's men coming up the road," Ezra panted. "Fancy men in a buggy. 3 of them." Levi added, his voice dropping to a whisper. "One's got a star on his vest." Miriam's stomach lurched. She smoothed her worn apron and stepped onto the porch, Clara close behind her. The approaching buggy kicked up a cloud of dust that hung in the still air like a verdict. Sheriff Coleman drove the lead horse, his territorial badge catching the sunlight, while 2 men in expensive suits sat beside him with the air of bureaucrats delivering bad news. Rose appeared in the doorway, her 8-year-old frame barely reaching Miriam's waist. She had been the baby when Thomas died, too young to understand why Papa never came home from the mine, too innocent to grasp the crushing weight of debt that followed his absence. Her wide blue eyes held the trust that Miriam fought every day to preserve. "Mrs. Vance," Sheriff Coleman called as he reined in the horses. His voice carried the formal tone of a man performing an unpleasant duty. "I need to speak with you about your situation." The 2 suits remained in the buggy consulting papers with the detached efficiency of men who dealt in human misery for a living. One was thin and pale with the look of a bank clerk who had never worked with his hands. The other was older, heavier, with cold eyes that inventoried the property like a buyer at market. "My situation is my own business," Miriam replied, though she knew the futility of the words. "I'm afraid it became territorial business when you defaulted on your husband's debts." Coleman dismounted his boots, stirring up small clouds of dust. "The court in Bitter Creek has issued a writ of attachment. You have 10 days to settle your obligations or face public auction." The words hit like physical blows. 10 days. Miriam's hands clenched into fists at her sides, her nails digging crescents into her palms. What obligations? Thomas paid his debts. The thin clerk cleared his throat and consulted his papers. Mining equipment lease $47 outstanding. Seed grain loan from Warwick Agricultural, $132 with interest. Cattle purchase contract, $128 plus penalties. He looked up with the bland expression of a man reading a grocery list. Total debt, $307 due in full, or the family enters debt service. Debt service. The territorial euphemism for a system barely distinguishable from slavery. Families who couldn't pay their debts were auctioned as contracted laborers bound to work for whoever bid highest until their obligations were satisfied. Children could be separated from parents. Wives from husbands. The law gave buyers nearly absolute authority over their contracted workers, limited only by territorial statutes that were rarely enforced in the remote regions. "My husband never borrowed from Warwick," Miriam said, though uncertainty crept into her voice. Thomas had been secretive about his business dealings in the months before his death, distracted and worried in ways he wouldn't explain. The heavy-set man spoke for the first time, his voice smooth as oiled leather. "Gideon Warwick purchased the notes from the original creditors. A perfectly legal transaction, I assure you. He was hoping to help your family through difficult times. Miriam had never met Gideon Warwick personally, but his reputation preceded him like the shadow of a storm cloud. He owned vast tracts of grazing land, a string of general stores and interests in half the mining operations in the territory. Men spoke his name with a mixture of respect and fear reserved for those who wielded absolute power in lawless places. 10 days. Sheriff Coleman repeated, handing her the official papers. The auction will be held in Bitter Creek at noon on Saturday. As the buggy disappeared down the dusty road, Miriam stood on her porch, feeling the weight of the papers in her hands like burning coals. Clara moved beside her close enough to offer comfort without needing words. The twins had retreated to the kitchen, their excited chatter about the fancy visitors dying away as they sensed the gravity of the moment. "What does it mean, Ma?" Rose asked, tugging at Miriam's skirt. Miriam knelt and gathered her youngest child into her arms, breathing in the sweet scent of her hair. "It means we're going to take a trip to town, sweetheart. Just for a little while." But over Rose's head, her eyes met Clara's, and in that exchange lay all the terrible truth that they couldn't speak aloud. In 10 days, their family might be scattered to the wind, sold to different buyers, who might take them hundreds of miles apart. Rose might grow up calling strangers by their parents' names. The twins might never see their sisters again. That night, after the younger children had been tucked into their beds, Miriam sat at the kitchen table with Thomas's papers spread before her, like the remnants of a shattered dream. By lamplight, the debt documents seemed to writhe on the page, their formal language a maze of legal terminology that she struggled to decipher. Clara sat across from her, her young face grave in the flickering light. "There has to be something we can do. $300 might as well be 3,000. Miriam said, rubbing her tired eyes. "The telegraph work is gone. The garden barely feeds us. I could sell everything we own and not raise half that much." "What about Nathaniel Kane? You said he was sweet on you before you married Papa." Miriam felt heat rise in her cheeks. "That was a long time ago, Clara. Before Sarah, before children, before—" She gestured helplessly at the papers. "Besides, he's facing his own troubles. But he's not in debt service. He could bid for us, couldn't he?" The suggestion hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. It was true that Nathaniel Kane, despite his recent losses, still owned his land free and clear. Sarah's father had been a railroad investor, whose legacy provided a small but steady income that kept the creditors at bay. If he chose to bid at the auction, he could purchase their family's labor contracts and what set them free. Employ them on his ranch, marry Miriam to legitimize the arrangement. The idea made her stomach churn with equal parts hope and humiliation. To approach Nathaniel Kane with such a request would mean admitting her complete failure to protect her children, her willingness to trade her independence for their safety. But what was pride worth against the prospect of Rose growing up in some stranger's kitchen, learning to call another woman mother? "I'll think about it," she said finally. Clara reached across the table and covered her mother's hand with her own. "We'll find a way, Ma. We always do." But even as Miriam squeezed her daughter's fingers, she felt the terrible weight of her situation pressing down like the summer heat. Tomorrow, she would have to make a choice that no mother should face: swallow her pride and beg for salvation, or watch her family be torn apart by forces beyond her control. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and stirring the dust in the yard. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled its voice lonely and wild in the vast emptiness of the Wyoming night. Miriam gathered the debt papers and carried them to the bedroom she had shared with Thomas, where his memory still lingered in the scent of sage and tobacco that no amount of washing could completely erase. She placed the documents in the cedar chest at the foot of the bed, beneath the wedding dress she would never wear again, and the christening gown that had clothed all 4 of her babies. As she prepared for sleep, Miriam whispered a prayer to a God who seemed as distant as the stars, asking for strength to face whatever tomorrow might bring. The morning of the 8th day dawned clear and merciless, the sun rising like a brass coin over the Wyoming hills. Miriam woke before dawn, her body tense with the knowledge that in 48 hours, everything would change. She dressed in her best remaining dress, a dark blue wool that had seen better years, but still maintained the dignity she would need for what lay ahead. The children sensed the importance of the day without being told. Clara helped Rose into her cleanest pinafore, while the twins polished their shoes with the solemnity of boys preparing for church. They had all grown thinner over the past months, their faces sharp with the hunger that had become their constant companion. But they carried themselves with the pride that Miriam had taught them to value above comfort. "Where are we going, Ma?" Ezra asked as they climbed into the wagon that Thomas had built with his own hands. "To see Mr. Kane." Miriam replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "To ask for his help." The Kane Ranch lay 3 miles south through a landscape of rolling hills and scattered cottonwoods that followed the meandering course of Bitter Creek. Once the road had been well-traveled, marked by the wagon ruts of hands driving cattle to market and visitors coming to call on one of the territory's most prosperous families. Now it showed signs of neglect, with washouts from spring rains that hadn't been properly repaired and gates hanging crooked on their hinges. The ranch house itself still maintained its imposing presence, a 2-story structure of native stone and timber that spoke of better times. But the paint was peeling, and several windows showed the temporary repairs of a man working alone. The corrals that had once held hundreds of cattle now contained perhaps 30 head, their ribs showing despite the summer grass. Nathaniel Kane emerged from the barn as their wagon pulled into the yard, his tall frame moving with the careful deliberation of a man nursing old injuries. At 43, he remained handsome in the weathered way of men who had spent their lives fighting the elements, his dark hair streaked with premature silver, and his blue eyes holding depths that spoke of losses too great for words. "Miriam," he said, removing his hat as she climbed down from the wagon. "Children, this is unexpected." There had been a time before Thomas when Nathaniel Kane's attention had made her heart race like a schoolgirl's. They had danced together at the territorial assembly, shared quiet conversations about books and dreams during the long winter socials when the community gathered to keep loneliness at bay. But she had chosen steady, practical Thomas over the dangerous excitement that Nathaniel represented, and he had married Sarah Whitman with her railroad money and Eastern education. Now they faced each other across the ruins of their respective dreams, 2 people who had learned that love and money were poor shields against the cruelty of fate. "Nathaniel, I need to speak with you about a business proposition." His eyebrows rose slightly, but he nodded toward the house. "Come inside. I'll put on coffee." The interior of the Kane house bore the unmistakable marks of a man living alone. The furniture was clean, but sparse with Sarah's decorative touches, gradually disappearing into practical necessity. The children clustered around the kitchen table, while Nathaniel moved with surprising grace through the motions of hospitality, his large hands delicate as he measured coffee grounds and stoked the fire. "The children look well," he said, though Miriam caught him noting their thinness, the careful way they eyed the plate of biscuits he set before them. "They're strong," she replied. "Clara's become quite accomplished with the telegraph key. The twins can work a full day's labor despite their age." "Rose," she faltered, looking at her youngest daughter's trusting face. "Rose has a gentle way with animals." Nathaniel poured coffee into thick ceramic mugs, his movements becoming slower as understanding dawned. "Miriam, what exactly are you asking me?" She had rehearsed the words during the sleepless nights, but now they felt like broken glass in her throat. "The debt auction is tomorrow. $307 or we go into contracted service. I'm asking you to bid for us." The silence stretched taut as a telegraph wire. Clara reached for Rose's hand while the twins stared at their shoes with the uncomfortable awareness of children witnessing adult desperation. "I won't lie to you about what I can offer," Nathaniel said slowly. "The ranch is struggling. I've got maybe $200 in ready cash and creditors of my own breathing down my neck. I can provide food, shelter, safety for your family, but I can't promise wealth or easy times. I'm not asking for charity." Miriam said, her pride flaring despite her circumstances. "We'll work for our keep. Clara can help with the books. She has a head for figures. The twins can handle ranch work. I can cook, clean, manage a household. And what would people say about a widow woman and her children living under my roof?" The question lay between them like a gauntlet thrown down. In the moral geography of the territorial West, such arrangements fell into gray areas that made respectable society uncomfortable. A man and woman living together without marriage invited scandal, but marriage between people of different social circumstances invited its own complications. "People will say what they choose to say," Miriam replied. "I'm more concerned with what my children will call the strangers who buy them tomorrow." Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from child to child before settling on Miriam's face. "There's something else you should know. Word around town is that Gideon Warwick has been asking questions about your family, specifically about Thomas's business dealings before he died." A chill ran down Miriam's spine. "What kind of questions?" "Mining claims, survey records, whether Thomas might have left behind any papers or documents." Nathaniel's voice dropped. "Amos Reed mentioned that Warwick seemed particularly interested in that cedar chest you keep." Amos Reed, the town blacksmith, was Nathaniel's oldest friend, and one of the few men in Bitter Creek who dared speak openly about Gideon Warwick's business practices. If Amos was sharing such information, it meant the situation was more dangerous than simple debt collection. "Thomas never told me about any special papers," Miriam said, though she felt the uncomfortable prick of incomplete knowledge. "Just the usual ranch documents, bills of sale, that sort of thing." "Maybe that's all there is," Nathaniel said. "But Warwick doesn't usually take such personal interest in debt collection. He has men for that." The implications hung in the air like smoke. If Gideon Warwick wanted something more than money from the Vance family, the debt auction might be just the beginning of their troubles. A man with Warwick's resources could make life very difficult for anyone who crossed his path, whether they owed him money or not. "Will you bid for us?" Miriam asked. Nathaniel looked at each of the children again, his expression thoughtful. "I'll bid $200. It's all I can spare and still keep food on the table through winter. And if someone bids higher, then we'll face that when it comes." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his own, his skin warm and calloused from ranch work. "Whatever happens tomorrow, Miriam, you're not facing it alone." The ride home passed in contemplative silence, each family member lost in private thoughts about the uncertain future. As they approached their homestead, Clara spoke for the first time since leaving the Kane Ranch. "Do you think 200 will be enough?" Miriam considered lying, offering false comfort to ease her daughter's worry. But Clara deserved honesty, especially now when childhood was ending faster than nature intended. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I know Nathaniel Kane is a good man who'll treat us fairly. That's more than we can say about some who might bid." That evening, as the family prepared for what might be their last night in the home Thomas had built, Miriam found herself drawn to the cedar chest with its cache of memories and documents. She lifted out the wedding dress, the christening gown, the small collection of letters from her sister in Kansas. Beneath it all lay Thomas's papers, bills of sale, mining claims, correspondence with business associates. She had examined these documents dozens of times over the months since his death, searching for some explanation of how their debts had grown so large. Most were routine, the paperwork of a man trying to scratch prosperity from unforgiving land. But as she handled them again, one letter caught her attention. It was dated 2 months before Thomas's death, written on letterhead from the Territorial Mining Commission. The language was formal, bureaucratic, but one paragraph leaped out at her. "Your report regarding irregularities in the Warwick Mining Company's operations has been received and will be investigated according to territorial statutes." Please maintain confidentiality regarding this matter until our investigation is complete." Miriam read the letter twice, her hands trembling. Thomas had been investigating Warwick's mining operations. He had never mentioned such a thing, never suggested that his death might have been anything more than the cholera that claimed so many frontier lives. A sound outside the window made her freeze. Footsteps in the yard trying to move quietly across the hard-packed earth. She blew out the lamp and peered through the curtains, her heart hammering against her ribs. 3 figures moved through the darkness, their shapes indistinct but purposeful. They approached the house with the stealth of men who meant no good, pausing frequently to listen for signs of detection. Miriam grabbed Thomas's rifle from the bedroom closet, checking to make sure it was loaded. The metallic click of the action seemed impossibly loud in the silent house. She crept to Clara's room and shook her daughter awake. "Get the children into the root cellar," she whispered. "Take the rifle. Don't come out until I call your name 3 times. Clara's eyes went wide, but she nodded and slipped from her bed without question. Years of frontier life had taught even children to respond quickly to danger. The front door rattled as someone tested the latch. Miriam positioned herself in the kitchen doorway, the rifle trained on the entrance. If these men meant to harm her family, they would pay dearly for the attempt. The door creaked open. A voice she didn't recognize spoke softly. "She's got to be here somewhere. Warwick said to search everything. What if she ain't got what he's looking for? Then we make sure she can't cause trouble at the auction tomorrow." Miriam's finger tightened on the trigger. These weren't random thieves. They were Warwick's men sent to find whatever Thomas had hidden and ensure her silence. The debt auction was a pretext. Warwick wanted something more valuable than money. The first intruder stepped into the kitchen, a thin man with the pale complexion of someone who avoided honest work. He carried a crowbar in one hand and a bullseye lantern in the other, its beam cutting through the darkness like a sword. "Stop right there," Miriam said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. The man spun toward her voice, raising the crowbar. Miriam squeezed the trigger. The rifle's roar filled the small house like thunder. The bullet took the intruder high in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to the floor with a scream of pain and surprise. The lantern shattered against the wall, its flame guttering out and plunging the room back into darkness. Shouts erupted from outside. More men than she had counted, perhaps as many as 6 or 7. Boots pounded on the porch as they regrouped from the unexpected resistance. "Burn it," someone shouted. "Burn the whole place." The smell of kerosene reached her nostrils seconds before she saw the flicker of flames through the front windows. They were torching the house with her and her children inside. Miriam ran toward the root cellar, calling Clara's name as fire began to lick at the walls. She had almost reached the cellar door when the kitchen window exploded inward, showering her with glass. More men poured through the breach, their faces masked by bandanas, and their hands holding more than guns, axes, torches, tools of destruction. Then the war cry split the night like a blade through silk. It rose from somewhere beyond the burning barn, wild and primal. A sound that carried the memory of buffalo hunts and tribal warfare. The attackers froze for a heartbeat, their faces turning toward the darkness with the instinctive fear of men who had heard death calling their names. A shadow moved against the flames, tall, lean, carrying weapons that caught the firelight. Miriam caught a glimpse of bronze skin, black hair, bound with leather eyes that reflected the fire like polished obsidian. The warrior moved with fluid grace, his bow singing as arrows found their marks with deadly precision. 2 of Warwick's men fell before the others could react. The remaining attackers scattered, seeking cover behind the well and the chicken coop, their confidence shattered by this unexpected intervention. "Who is that?" one of them shouted. "Cheyenne." Another replied, his voice tight with fear. "They're supposed to be gone. Driven north years ago." The warrior appeared at the kitchen window, his face painted with traditional war markings that made him look like something from legend. He spoke to Miriam in accented English, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to command. "Take your children. Go to Kane. I will follow." "Who are you?" she asked. Talek of the Cheyenne. Your husband helped my brother escape Warwick's mine before the cave-in. I pay the debt. Before she could respond, he vanished back into the flames, his war cry echoing across the valley as he continued his deadly work. Miriam ran to the root cellar and pulled her children from their hiding place. Clara still clutching the rifle with white-knuckled determination. The wagon! Miriam gasped. We have to reach the wagon. They ran through smoke and chaos, the children clinging to her skirts as gunfire echoed from the yard. The barn was fully engulfed now, its flames reaching toward the star-filled sky like grasping fingers. Their wagon stood 20 yards away, the horses stamping nervously, but still in harness. A figure stepped from behind the well. Silas Holt, Warwick's chief enforcer, his scarred face twisted with rage. He raised a pistol toward the fleeing family, his finger tightening on the trigger. Talek materialized behind him like smoke given form. A knife flashed, and Holt crumpled without firing a shot. The Cheyenne warrior met Miriam's eyes across the burning yard and nodded once before disappearing again into the night. The family reached the wagon, just as the house caught fire in earnest flames racing across the roof with hungry speed. Miriam whipped the horses into motion, driving them hard toward the Kane Ranch, while behind them, their home became a pillar of fire against the darkness. Rose was crying, her small body shaking with terror and confusion. The twins pressed close to their mother, their faces pale with shock. Only Clara seemed to maintain her composure, though Miriam could see the tremor in her hands as she struggled to process what they had witnessed. Why did they want to hurt us, Ma? Ezra asked. Miriam didn't have an answer that would make sense to a 12-year-old boy. How could she explain that their father had apparently discovered something that threatened a powerful man's interests, that their debt auction was merely a convenient cover for more sinister motives? Some men do terrible things to protect their secrets, she said finally. Your father was a good man who tried to do right. Sometimes that makes enemies. The Kane Ranch appeared ahead of them, its windows glowing with lamplight. Nathaniel met them in the yard, fully dressed, despite the late hour, his rifle ready in his hands. I saw the fire, he said grimly. Thought it might be trouble. Miriam climbed down from the wagon, her legs shaking with exhaustion and delayed shock. Warwick's men. They came looking for something in Thomas's papers. They would have killed us all, if not for... She paused, realizing how incredible her story would sound. A Cheyenne warrior named Talek saved our lives. Nathaniel's expression grew thoughtful. Talek, I've heard that name before. There were stories a few years back about a mine cave-in at one of Warwick's operations. Killed a dozen Chinese workers and at least one Cheyenne. The territorial authorities called it an accident, but there were whispers about corner-cutting and unsafe practices. He said Thomas helped his brother escape before the cave-in. That sounds like Thomas. He never could stand seeing people mistreated. Nathaniel helped the children down from the wagon, his manner gentle despite the circumstances. Whatever he discovered about Warwick's operations, it was dangerous enough to kill for. They gathered in Nathaniel's kitchen while he made coffee, and Clara tended to Rose's scratches from the broken window. The twins sat close together, their usual chatter replaced by the somber awareness that their world had changed forever. The auction is still tomorrow, Miriam said. Even with the house burned, the debt remains. Maybe that's for the best, Nathaniel replied. Warwick can't very well bid on your family's labor contracts after sending men to murder you tonight. Too many questions. You think he'll give up? Men like Warwick don't give up. They adapt. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. But they also can't afford to appear too eager for something they claim not to want. Tomorrow's auction will proceed, and I'll bid what I promised. After that, we'll see what game he's really playing. As dawn broke over the Wyoming hills, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, the Vance family prepared for what might be their last day of freedom. The burned remnants of their homestead stood like a blackened tooth against the horizon. But they were alive together, and ready to face whatever judgment awaited them in Bitter Creek. The courthouse square in Bitter Creek buzzed with the uncomfortable energy of a crowd gathered to witness human misery. Territorial law required debt auctions to be held in public, ostensibly to ensure fairness. But the effect was more akin to a carnival, where desperation served as the main attraction. Families facing auction stood on the wooden platform like livestock at market, their possessions spread before them for inspection by potential bidders. Miriam held Rose's hand as they climbed the steps to the auction block, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. The crowd pressed close, ranchers looking for cheap labor merchants seeking domestic help, and the merely curious drawn by the spectacle of a respectable family brought low by circumstance. At the back of the square, Gideon Warwick sat in his black carriage like a spider at the center of a web. He was a man of average height, but commanding presence, his expensive clothes and carefully groomed appearance marking him as someone accustomed to getting his way. When his pale eyes found Miriam's face, his lips curved in what might have been a smile on a more pleasant face. "Now, ladies and gentlemen," the auctioneer called, his voice carrying across the square with practiced authority, "we have before us the Vance family holdings debt of $307 payable in cash or through contracted labor services." He began reading the inventory in a monotone that reduced their lives to a list of assets. One female, age 35, experienced in telegraph operations and household management. One female, age 16, literate and capable of general labor. Two males, age 12, suitable for ranch or farm work. One female, age 8, suitable for domestic service. The clinical language made Miriam feel sick. They were people, not livestock, but the law saw no difference when it came to debt collection. Her children stood close around her, their faces pale but determined, presenting a united front against the hostile crowd. "Do I hear opening bids for the lot?" $50, called a voice from the crowd. A rancher from the South County known for working his hands hard and paying them little. $75, countered another bidder. Miriam searched the crowd for Nathaniel's face, finding him near the front with Amos Reed beside him. The blacksmith was a broad-shouldered man with work-hardened hands and a reputation for honesty in a town where such qualities were increasingly rare. He caught her eye and nodded slightly, offering what reassurance he could. $100. Nathaniel called, his voice steady. The bidding continued, climbing slowly toward the $200 he had promised. Other voices joined the auction, merchants seeking household help, ranchers needing seasonal labor. Even a few women looking for assistance with their own domestic burdens. At $180, most of the bidders dropped out. The price was approaching the limit of what most frontier families could afford for contracted labor, especially when they would be responsible for housing and feeding their workers. $190, Nathaniel bid. $200, called a new voice. Miriam's heart sank as she recognized the speaker. Marcus Webb, Warwick's foreman, a hard man who ran the mining operations with brutal efficiency. If Webb was bidding, it meant Warwick was making his move, despite the previous night's failed attack. $210. Nathaniel responded, his voice tight. Webb consulted with someone in the crowd, probably Warwick himself, though the cattle baron remained in his carriage. $250. The square fell silent. $250 was serious money, more than most people saw in a year. Nathaniel's jaw worked as he calculated his resources, his dream of saving the Vance family slipping away, with each escalating bid. Going once for $250, the auctioneer called. Miriam closed her eyes, feeling the weight of defeat settle on her shoulders like a lead blanket. Webb would take them to Warwick's mine, where they would disappear into the brutal labor that had killed Talek's brother and countless others. Her children would grow up in the darkness underground, their spirits broken by the endless pursuit of gold and silver. For a man who valued human life less than ore samples. Going twice. $260. The voice came from the edge of the crowd. Amos Reed stepped forward, his leather apron marking him as a working man, his calloused hands holding a small leather pouch that clinked with the sound of coins. Webb's face darkened. $270. $280. Amos replied without hesitation. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Where had the blacksmith found such money? His shop did well enough, but not well enough to support nearly $300 in ready cash for a labor contract. Other voices began joining the bidding. Sarah Mitchell, who ran the general store with her husband. Doc Preston, the territorial physician. Even Pastor Williams from the Methodist Church. Small bids $5 and $10 each, but adding up with surprising speed. Miriam stared in wonder as more members of the community stepped forward. People she barely knew, families who had their own struggles offering what little they could spare to keep her family from Warwick's grasp. Mrs. Henderson, whose own farm had been foreclosed just weeks before. The Martinez family, who faced constant discrimination despite their citizenship papers. Even some of the Chinese miners led by a man named Chen, who worked Thomas's old claim. Webb looked increasingly desperate as the bids climbed past $300. He consulted again with his hidden backer, but even Warwick's resources had limits when it came to public displays of his intentions. To bid higher would attract attention from territorial authorities raising questions about why he wanted the Vance family so badly. $320. Amos called, his voice carrying across the now silent square. Webb's face went pale. He opened his mouth as if to bid again, then closed it with visible effort. Behind him, Miriam caught a glimpse of Warwick's carriage pulling away from the square, the cattle baron apparently unwilling to expose himself further to public scrutiny. Sold to Amos Reed for $320. The auctioneer declared, bringing his gavel down with a bang that echoed off the courthouse walls. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, but Miriam barely heard them. She was staring at Amos Reed, trying to understand what had just happened. The blacksmith approached the platform with his receipt from the clerk, his expression serious, despite the celebration around them. "Mrs. Vance," he said formally, "I'm purchasing your family's labor contracts for the period specified by territorial law. Do you understand the terms?" "I understand," she replied, though she didn't understand anything at all. Amos pulled a second document from his pocket and handed it to her. "This is a manumission certificate, properly notarized and filed with the territorial clerk. Effective immediately, your family's contracted labor obligations are forgiven and your freedom restored." Miriam read the document with trembling hands, the legal language swimming before her eyes. But the meaning was clear. Amos Reed had purchased their contracts only to immediately set them free. "Why?" she whispered. "Because that's what neighbors do," he replied simply. "And because your husband once helped my boy when he was hurt in my shop. Good deeds deserve good deeds in return." Clara stepped forward, her young face serious. "Mr. Reed, we can't ever repay you for this." "Don't need repaying, miss. Just need you to remember that there are still good people in this world, even when times are hard." He looked at Miriam. "Nathaniel's offered you work and shelter at his place. Fair wages, decent treatment. It's not charity, you'll earn your keep. But it's honest work among honest people." As the crowd began to disperse, families returning to their daily struggles with stories to tell about the day community spirit triumphed over greed, Miriam gathered her children close. They were free, truly free, but she knew their troubles were far from over. Gideon Warwick was not a man who accepted defeat gracefully, and whatever secrets Thomas had discovered would continue to make them targets. Nathaniel appeared beside them, his face showing relief mixed with concern. "We should get you back to the ranch before Warwick has time to regroup. This was a public humiliation for him. He won't forget it." As they loaded into the wagon for the journey to their new home, Miriam caught sight of a familiar figure watching from the tree line beyond the town. Talek sat astride a painted horse, his weapons visible across his back, his dark eyes tracking their movement. When he saw her looking, he raised one hand in what might have been a salute or a promise. Then he was gone, vanishing into the trees like smoke on the wind. The first month at the Kane Ranch passed with deceptive tranquility. Miriam threw herself into the work of managing a household, again finding comfort in the familiar rhythms of cooking, cleaning, and tending to the practical needs of daily life. Clara helped with the ranch books, her quick mind grasping the complexities of cattle prices and seasonal expenses with surprising ease. The twins took to ranch work with the enthusiasm of boys who had spent too much time cooped up in a cramped homestead learning to rope calves and mend fences under Nathaniel's patient instruction. Even Rose began to bloom in the security of regular meals and a warm bed, her laughter returning like bird song after a long winter. She had adopted a half-wild barn cat that tolerated her affection with feline dignity, and her days were filled with the simple pleasures of childhood that had been too rare during their months of grinding poverty. But beneath the surface of this domestic peace, tensions simmered like steam in a covered pot. Nathaniel rode the fence lines with increasing frequency, his rifle always within reach, watching for signs that Warwick's men were scouting the property. The townspeople who had contributed to their freedom at the auction now faced subtle pressure from Warwick's business interests, delayed payments for goods, canceled contracts, social ostracism that made their daily lives more difficult. Most troubling of all were the questions that continued to circle around Thomas's death and the papers he might have left behind. Sheriff Coleman visited twice, claiming to investigate the burning of the Vance homestead, but asking more questions about Thomas's mining activities than about the arson itself. His inquiries made it clear that pressure was being applied from higher up the territorial hierarchy, pressure that had Gideon Warwick's fingerprints all over it. He's not going to give up, Nathaniel said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the Wyoming hills. Warwick's got too much invested in whatever Thomas discovered to let it go. Miriam rocked slowly in Sarah's old chair, her hands busy with mending, while her mind wrestled with problems that seemed to have no solution. Maybe I should look through Thomas's papers again. If there's something specific he's after, maybe we can use it to negotiate. Or maybe we can use it to destroy him, Clara said quietly. Both adults turned to look at the 16-year-old who had been unusually quiet during their conversation. Her face held an expression of determined calculation that reminded Miriam uncomfortably of Thomas in his most stubborn moods. Clara, this isn't a game, Miriam warned. Warwick has already proven he's willing to kill to protect his secrets. Then maybe it's time someone fought back with more than just hiding and hoping. Clara's voice carried a steel edge that made her sound older than her years. Papa found something important enough to die for. Don't we owe it to him to make sure his sacrifice meant something? Before Miriam could respond, the sound of approaching horses cut through the evening air. 3 riders emerged from the gathering dusk, their faces hidden by the brims of their hats, but their postures suggesting anything but friendly intentions. Nathaniel was on his feet instantly, his hand moving to the rifle propped against the porch rail. "Get inside," he ordered quietly. "Take the children to the back room." But as the riders drew closer, the lead figure pushed back his hat to reveal the weathered features of Amos Reed. Behind him rode Doc Preston and Pastor Williams, their faces grave but not threatening. "Evening, Nathaniel," Amos called as they reined in their horses. "We need to talk." Nathaniel relaxed slightly but kept his rifle close. "What's on your mind, Amos?" The blacksmith dismounted heavily, his movement suggesting a man carrying burdens beyond his physical weight. "It's about the auction money. About where it really came from." Miriam felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cooling air. "What do you mean?" Doc Preston spoke up, his professional manner, unable to hide his discomfort. "Some of us have been talking, Mrs. Vance. About the timing of our good fortune, about how we all seem to have extra money just when you needed it most." "You're not making sense," Nathaniel said. Pastor Williams cleared his throat. 3 days before the auction, each of us found anonymous envelopes containing cash and notes suggesting we contribute to the Vance family's cause. We assumed they came from a secret benefactor, someone who wanted to help but remain anonymous. Amos nodded grimly. But today, I got another envelope. Same handwriting, different message. He pulled a folded paper from his pocket and handed it to Nathaniel. Read it. Nathaniel unfolded the note, his expression growing darker as he read. Finally, he looked up at Miriam, his face pale in the lamplight. It's from Warwick. He says he arranged for our benefactor to provide the auction money, and now he wants his investment back with interest. The implications hit Miriam like a physical blow. Warwick had manipulated the entire auction, allowing them to win their freedom, while creating a new form of debt that gave him leverage over not just her family, but everyone who had helped them. How much interest? She asked, though she dreaded the answer. $500 due in 30 days, Amos replied. Plus a guarantee that you'll turn over any papers or documents Thomas left behind. And if we refuse, Doc Preston answered, his voice heavy with worry. Then he exposes the fact that we all accepted what amounts to stolen money to interfere with a legal auction. Sheriff Coleman would have no choice but to arrest us for fraud and conspiracy. The web of Warwick's manipulation was breathtaking in its complexity. He had turned their moment of community triumph into a trap that ensnared not just the Vance family, but everyone who had tried to help them. Now they faced a choice between bankruptcy and betrayal, with innocent people suffering regardless of which path they chose. There has to be another way. Clara said, her young voice cutting through the adult's despair. He's too smart to leave himself without protection, but he's also too greedy to resist a bigger prize. What do you mean? Nathaniel asked. Whatever Papa found, it's worth more to Warwick than $500 or even control over our family. Maybe it's worth enough that he'd trade our freedom for it outright. Miriam felt a surge of maternal fear. Clara, we don't even know what Thomas discovered, let alone whether it's valuable enough to bargain with. Then maybe it's time we found out. That night, while the rest of the household slept, Miriam and Clara spread Thomas's papers across the kitchen table like pieces of a puzzle they had never learned to solve. By lamplight, they examined every document, every letter, every scrap of handwriting for clues about what Thomas had discovered in the months before his death. The mining commission letter was clearly important, but it raised more questions than it answered. What irregularities had Thomas reported? How had he discovered them? And most importantly, what evidence had he gathered to support his accusation? Look at this, Clara said, holding up a surveyor's map marked with Thomas's handwriting. These aren't the boundaries of Papa's mining claim. This shows the Warwick operations extending onto federal land. Miriam studied the map, comparing it to other documents from Thomas's files. Slowly, a pattern began to emerge. He was tracking claim jumping. Warwick's been mining outside his legal boundaries and falsifying records to cover it up. And that's why the cave-in killed so many people, Clara realized. They were working in tunnels that weren't supposed to exist, so there were no safety inspections, no proper supports. The scope of the crime was staggering. Warwick had been systematically stealing federal mining claims using fraudulent surveys and bribed officials to expand his operations far beyond their legal limits. The human cost of his greed was measured in the lives of miners who died in unsafe conditions while extracting ore from stolen land. But where's the proof? Miriam asked. The mining commission would need more than Thomas's word to investigate someone like Warwick. Clara had been studying a small leather journal they had almost overlooked among the other papers. I think I found it. Papa kept detailed records of his own survey work, but look at these entries from last spring. She pointed to pages covered with Thomas's careful handwriting, documenting dates, times, and locations where he had observed Warwick's mining operations. But more than that, the journal contained sketches and measurements that clearly showed the discrepancies between official claim boundaries and actual excavation sites. He was building a case, Miriam whispered. Systematic documentation that could prove Warwick's crimes in territorial court. And Warwick found out before Papa could present it to the authorities. The journal represented more than evidence. It was Thomas's legacy, his attempt to protect the honest miners and settlers who were being victimized by Warwick's corruption. But it was also incredibly dangerous. In the wrong hands, it could be used to implicate innocent people or twisted to protect the guilty. "What do we do with it?" Clara asked. Before Miriam could answer, a sound outside the kitchen window made them both freeze. Footsteps in the yard, moving with the careful stealth they had learned to associate with danger. Miriam blew out the lamp and moved to the window, peering through the curtains into the moonlit yard. 3 figures moved through the shadows, men with rifles who were clearly scouting the ranch buildings with hostile intent. "Get Nathaniel," she whispered to Clara. "Tell him to wake the twins and Rose. Get them to the barn." "What about you?" "I'm going to hide this journal where Warwick will never find it." As Clara slipped away to rouse the household, Miriam gathered Thomas's papers and moved toward the stone fireplace that dominated one wall of the kitchen. Sarah Kane had designed the hearth with a hidden compartment for storing valuables during Indian raids, a feature that might now save her husband's evidence from destruction. The loose stone came away easily, revealing a cavity just large enough for the journal and the most important documents. Miriam wrapped them in oiled cloth and sealed them behind the stone just as the first gunshots shattered the night air. But this time, the attackers had come prepared for resistance. Instead of the chaotic assault that had destroyed her homestead, they moved with military precision, cutting off escape routes and herding the family toward a killing ground of their own choosing. Flames erupted from multiple directions, at once the barn, the bunkhouse, even the well house blazing with the orange glow of deliberately set fires. Warwick's men had learned from their previous failures surrounding the ranch with a ring of fire that left no avenue for escape. Nathaniel burst into the kitchen, his rifle in his hands, and his face grim with determination. "They've got us surrounded. At least a dozen men, maybe more. The children?" Clara got them to the root cellar under the barn. It's stone-lined, should protect them from the fire for a while. He moved to the window and peered out at the chaos. "But we can't hold them off forever." A voice called from the yard, amplified by a speaking trumpet that carried clearly over the crackling flames. "Nathaniel Kane, send out the Vance woman and her brats, and we'll let you live to see morning." Nathaniel's answer was a rifle shot that shattered the speaker's trumpet and sent the hidden gunman scrambling for cover. "That's what I think of your offer." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Gunfire erupted from every direction, bullets shattering windows and splintering wooden shutters as Warwick's men poured lead into the ranch house. Miriam and Nathaniel pressed themselves against the stone walls, returning fire when they could, but hopelessly outgunned by their attackers. "We need a miracle," Nathaniel muttered, reloading his rifle with practiced efficiency. That was when the war cry split the night like a blade through silk. It rose from somewhere beyond the burning barn, wild and primal, carrying echoes of ancient battles and tribal honor. The gunfire faltered as Warwick's men turned toward this new threat, their confidence shaken by the unexpected intervention. Talek emerged from the flames like an avenging spirit, his weapons singing death songs as arrows found their marks with supernatural accuracy. But he was not alone. Behind him came other figures, Chinese miners from the diggings, displaced ranchers who had lost their land to Warwick's schemes, even some of the townspeople who had contributed to the auction fund. They fought with the desperate fury of people who had nothing left to lose, their rage focused like a blade against the forces that had oppressed them for too long. Amos Reed wielded a sledgehammer with the same skill he used on his anvil, while Doc Preston used his knowledge of anatomy to devastating effect with a cavalry saber that had seen service in distant wars. The tide of battle turned in minutes, but the cost was terrible. Men fell on both sides, their blood soaking into the Wyoming dirt, while the fires raged uncontrolled around them. Miriam watched from the kitchen window as her neighbors fought and died for the principle that common people deserved justice, even when it came at the point of a gun. Through the chaos, she saw a figure approaching the house with purposeful stride, Gideon Warwick himself, his expensive clothes singed by the flames, his pale eyes fixed on the kitchen window where she stood. He carried a pistol in one hand and a torch in the other, his face twisted with the rage of a man whose carefully laid plans had been shattered by forces beyond his control. Mrs. Vance. He called, his cultured voice cutting through the battle noise. I know you're in there. Send out Thomas's papers and I'll call off my men. Nathaniel appeared beside her, blood streaming from a scalp wound, but his rifle steady in his hands. He's bluffing. His men are losing and he knows it. Maybe. But I won't risk the children on a maybe. Miriam moved toward the door, ignoring Nathaniel's protests. Warwick, I'll trade myself for their safety. The cattle baron paused in his advance, his head tilted like a predator considering unexpected prey. Interesting proposal. You and the papers in exchange for your family's lives. Done. Miriam stepped onto the porch, her hands raised to show she carried no weapons. Behind her, she could hear Nathaniel cursing her decision, but she knew there was no other choice. Warwick would never stop hunting them, never cease his efforts to silence the evidence of his crimes. Someone had to end the cycle of violence, even if it meant personal sacrifice. Warwick approached the porch steps, his pistol trained on her chest. Where are they? Safe. And they'll stay safe as long as you honor our bargain. I'm a man of my word, Mrs. Vance, when it suits my interests. His smile was cold as winter morning. Bring me the papers, and we'll discuss terms. That was when Clara stepped out of the barn, Thomas's journal clutched in her hands like a shield. Her clothes were singed from the fires, her face streaked with soot and tears, but her voice carried across the yard with startling clarity. Looking for this, Mr. Warwick. The cattle baron spun toward her, his pistol shifting to target the 16-year-old girl who held his future in her hands. Give it to me, child. You don't understand what you're holding. I understand perfectly. Papa died because he found out you've been stealing federal land and murdering minors to cover it up. Clara's voice grew stronger with each word. This journal proves everything. Dates, locations, names of your victims. Clara, no. Miriam started toward her daughter, but Warwick's pistol swung back to cover her. Stay where you are, Mrs. Vance. The girl and I need to have a conversation. He took a step toward Clara, his finger tightening on the trigger. Hand over the journal, and I might let you live to grow up. Clara's response was to hold the journal over the flames consuming the barn wall behind her. One step closer, and it burns. All of Papa's work, all the evidence against you gone forever. Warwick froze his face, contorting with frustrated rage. The journal represented not just evidence of his crimes, but documentation of his entire illegal operation. Without it, territorial authorities would have nothing but rumors and speculation to base any investigation on. What do you want? He asked through gritted teeth. Justice for the men who died in your mines. Compensation for their families. And a guarantee that you'll never threaten anyone in this territory again. Impossible. You're asking me to destroy everything I've built? Then I guess Papa's journal burns. Clara moved the leather-bound book closer to the flames, its pages beginning to curl from the heat. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring with battle raging around them, and the fate of the territory hanging in the balance. Then Talek appeared behind Warwick, like a shadow given form, his knife pressed against the cattle baron's throat before the man could react. Drop the gun, the Cheyenne warrior said quietly. Your fight is with me now. Warwick's pistol clattered to the ground. You're supposed to be dead savage. My men reported you killed in the mine cave-in. Your men reported what you paid them to report. But I lived to see my brother buried and to swear vengeance on those who murdered him. Talek's knife pressed deeper, drawing a thin line of blood. Now you will answer for your crimes. Wait, Clara called, still holding the journal near the flames. If you kill him, we lose the chance to expose everything he's done. The other miners the stolen land. All of it dies with him. Talik's dark eyes met hers across the burning yard. Justice or vengeance? Choose wisely, young one. The battle around them was ending, Warwick's hired guns fleeing into the night, as the combined force of townspeople and miners proved too much for their mercenary loyalty. But the real conflict was just beginning, the struggle between the desire for immediate retribution and the patient work of building lasting justice. Clara pulled the journal back from the flames, her decision made. We take him to the territorial capital. Let the federal marshals deal with his crimes. The territorial authorities are in his pocket. Nathaniel said, emerging from the house with rope to bind their prisoner. He'll buy his way out of any local jail. Not if we make his crimes public first. Doc Preston said, approaching with several other townspeople who had survived the battle. I know a newspaper editor in Denver who'd pay good money for a story this big. Amos Reed nodded grimly. And I know a federal judge who owes me a favor from the war. Man like that might be interested in corruption charges that reach this high. As dawn broke over the Wyoming hills, painting the smoky sky in shades of rose and gold, the community that had formed around the Vance family's struggle prepared to see justice done at last. Warwick sat bound and defeated his empire of corruption, crumbling as quickly as it had been built. But the cost had been terrible. Several good men had died in the night's fighting, their sacrifice adding weight to the victory that felt more like survival than triumph. The Kane Ranch was largely destroyed, its buildings reduced to smoking ruins that would require months to rebuild. Most importantly, the bonds forged in fire between neighbors who had risked everything for each other proved stronger than any force Warwick could bring against them. They had learned that community was not just a word, but a living thing that required courage and sacrifice to maintain. As the prisoners were loaded into wagons for the journey to territorial justice, Talik approached Miriam, where she stood with her children. The Cheyenne warrior bore fresh wounds from the night's battle, but his eyes held peace for the first time since she had met him. Your husband was a good man, he said simply. He helped my brother when no one else would. Now the debt is paid, and the dead can rest. What will you do now? She asked. Return to my people. Tell them that sometimes justice can be found even in the white man's world. He looked at Clara, who still clutched her father's journal like a sacred trust. Guard that book well, young one. Truth is a powerful weapon, but only if it survives to be used. 3 months later, Miriam stood in the kitchen of the rebuilt Kane Ranch house, reading a letter from Denver that brought news of Gideon Warwick's conviction on federal charges of claim-jumping fraud and conspiracy. The cattle baron would spend the rest of his life in a territorial prison, his vast holdings broken up and distributed to the families he had wronged. But more important than Warwick's fate was the transformation that had taken place in the Wyoming Territory itself. Thomas's journal had exposed a network of corruption that reached from local mining operations to the territorial capital, leading to investigations that cleaned house throughout the region's government. The Chinese miners who had fought beside them now worked claims of their own, protected by new laws that guaranteed equal treatment regardless of race or origin. The displaced ranchers had received compensation for their stolen lands, allowing them to rebuild their lives with dignity intact. Most significantly, the Wyoming Territory had become a beacon for other Western regions, struggling with similar problems of corruption and exploitation. Federal authorities pointed to the Bitter Creek investigation as proof that the rule of law could reach even the most remote frontiers if people were willing to stand up for justice. The new barn's finished, Nathaniel said, entering the kitchen with the satisfaction of a man who had seen hard work come to fruition. Clara's right about expanding the horse breeding operation. There's good money in quality stock, and we've got the best grazing land in the territory. Miriam smiled at the ease with which he said, "we." Their marriage 3 weeks earlier had been a quiet affair witnessed by the same community that had risked everything to save her family from debt slavery. It was a union born of mutual respect and shared trials rather than passionate romance. But it had already proven stronger than many marriages built on easier foundations. "Speaking of Clara, where is she?" Miriam asked. "Teaching Rose and the twins to read law books. Says if they're going to inherit this place someday, they need to understand how to protect it legally." Nathaniel's chuckle held pride mixed with bemusement. "That daughter of yours has plans that reach far beyond ranching." Indeed, Clara had announced her intention to study law and eventually run for territorial office, driven by the conviction that lasting change required people willing to work within the system to reform it. At 17, she possessed a combination of intelligence, determination, and practical experience that made such ambitions seem achievable rather than merely wishful. The twins had thrown themselves into ranch work with the enthusiasm of boys who had found their calling, while Rose continued to charm everyone with her gentle way, with animals, and her gift for finding beauty in the harsh landscape of the Wyoming frontier. They were growing up strong and confident, shaped by hardship, but not broken by it. As evening approached, the family gathered on the porch to watch the sun set over land that was theirs by right of sacrifice and struggle. In the distance, the lights of Bitter Creek twinkled like earthbound stars, each one representing a neighbor who had proven that community was stronger than greed, that justice was worth fighting for even when the odds seemed impossible. Miriam reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a letter that had arrived that morning from Kansas, where her sister wrote of their own struggles with drought and economic hardship. She had been planning to invite them to Wyoming to offer them the same chance at a fresh start that her family had found. "Another family in need?" Nathaniel asked, reading her expression. "My sister and her children. They're facing foreclosure on their farm just like we were." "Then we'll help them," he said without hesitation. "That's what families do. That's what neighbors do." Clara looked up from the legal textbook she was studying by lamplight. "We could establish a formal assistance program. Use Papa's journal as leverage to create a territorial fund for families facing debt slavery. Make sure what happened to us doesn't happen to others." The idea had merit, and Miriam could see the wheels turning in her daughter's sharp mind as she considered the practical and legal steps necessary to make such a program reality. Clara had inherited Thomas's sense of justice and moral purpose, but she had also learned pragmatism from their struggles, understanding that good intentions needed solid foundations to achieve lasting results. As the stars appeared in the vast Wyoming sky, each family member carried their own dreams and plans for the future. But they were united by bonds stronger than blood, the ties forged by shared sacrifice, mutual support, and the knowledge that they had faced the worst the frontier could offer, and emerged not just intact, but stronger. The wind that swept across the prairie carried the scent of sage and growing grass, but also something else, the promise of rain clouds building on the horizon, bringing the moisture that would make the land bloom with new life. It was a fitting metaphor for their own journey from desperation to hope, from isolation to community, from powerlessness to the quiet strength that came from knowing they could face whatever challenges tomorrow might bring. In the end, that was perhaps the greatest victory of all. Not the defeat of a single corrupt man, but the proof that ordinary people could build something lasting and good in the midst of a harsh and often cruel world. The Wyoming Territory would always be a place where survival depended on strength and determination. But it was also a place where justice was possible if people were willing to stand together and fight for it. As Miriam tucked Rose into bed that night, her youngest daughter asked the question that had been on all their minds during the long months of struggle and recovery. "Do you think Papa knows how everything turned out?" Miriam smoothed her daughter's hair and considered the question seriously. "I think he knows that his work mattered, that people remembered what he stood for and carried it forward. That's the kind of memorial any good man would want. Will you tell me about him again, about how he used to sing while he worked?" And so Miriam shared the stories one more time, keeping alive the memory of a man who had died trying to do right in a world that often rewarded the opposite. Thomas's legacy lived on, not just in the journal that had brought down Gideon Warwick, but in the principles he had taught his family and the example he had set for his community. Outside, the wind continued to blow across the endless grassland, carrying with it the voices of all those who had struggled and sacrificed to build something worth passing on to the next generation. It was the sound of America itself, raw and unfinished, but full of possibility, a place where courage and determination could still triumph over corruption and greed. The Vance family had found their place in that larger story, their trials and triumphs becoming part of the legend of the American West. They had learned that freedom was not a gift, but a responsibility, that justice required vigilance, and that the bonds of family and community were the strongest forces in a world that often seemed designed to tear people apart. As the Wyoming night settled over the ranch like a familiar blanket, they slept peacefully in the knowledge that they had earned their rest and their place in the world. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities, but they would face them together as they had learned to face everything with courage, with hope, and with the unshakable conviction that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they stood together for what was right.